All right, we'll start with a short one. I guess this, Jenet, is mostly for you. It says, are girls who are adopted likely to enter puberty earlier since the father in the home is not their biological father? Is that available?
That's a really good question. And I think, I don't know definitively about this, and I think it's been hard actually to study. It's one of those methodological things that may be challenging to study because you can't compare, right, an adopted versus an unadopted necessarily because they have very different genetic makeup. So I don't know for sure. I think we could say there's likely to be some effect, but we don't know what that is exactly, or if it's the same.
This is a longer question. It says, the widespread acceptance and normalization of premarital sex has been a primary driver of family breakdown. There's a list of horribles there. Yet we see the acceptability of premarital sexual relations even among the religious. If we can't convince the religious that this is highly problematic, how do we convince the secular? Any ideas?
I wrote a book on that subject. Though this is a little bit different kind of question. The thing I want to go back to is that we live in a very different era when it comes to premarital sex, post-contraceptive and pre-contraceptive. Because, you know, you flirt with sex long enough back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and somebody was going to have a marriage decision to make pretty quick. So it's almost as if, you know, when birth control comes online in the 60s, it was intended for married women, right? And that didn't stand a Supreme Court test for very long, such that sort of now it percolates among younger people and unmarried people, et cetera. So it's almost, you know, when I first heard the question sort of saying, well, you know, this is common now, and even religious kids. Historically, the most effective means of preventing premarital sex was the threat of pregnancy. It had very little to do with religion per se. It was sort of the fear of this. And so now, I mean, religious organizations in some ways have been met with this problem of how do we motivate something that we've never really had to motivate before, not nearly so effectively. And so, you know, I grew up Dutch Calvinist in the middle of Iowa. It wasn't my era, but my parents' era, where, you know, if you were, you know, if somebody got pregnant, they'd go in front of the congregation and make all sorts of apologies. And I always thought, like, well, you know, and the ones who are on birth controls didn't have to do that. So it always seemed kind of unfair in some ways. But really, yeah, it is normal now among most Americans. Less so among people who marry, of course, when they're, say, 21, 22, 23. We still see waiting till marriage is pretty common, although we'd call that a selectivity effect. The kind of kids who are marrying at 22 are just not quite like the kids who are marrying at 32. They're more likely to be religious, etc. So complaining about premarital sex, while it makes sense from a religious perspective, is wrapped up in a variety of phenomena that everybody before 50 years ago really didn't deal with quite in the same way.
Jason?
Mark, I'm going to quote you. I remember Mark saying one time that we're going to have a very difficult time trying to espouse what for many they would label the biblical ethic of sexuality if we're going to fully embrace the secular model of marriage. And so in some ways, this is a great example of a marriage culture and how indeed sexuality and our culture of sexuality is intertwined. It's a very different idea, as you mentioned, marriage ages, to espouse to young people an abstinence ethic and a value of reserving and refraining until marriage. That's a pretty different standard and ethic at 22 than 32, right? And so there's a fragmentation there that has been distinguished. And so our ethic of marriage and our ideas around sexuality and it having purposes and having intended expressions within marriage and tied to, as we've been talking about today, this complete union that is possible, is a very different vision But if we separate that and we talk about sexuality as if it has nothing to do with marriage, or that's so far down the horizon that we come with a different approach, and it's a very different thing in young people's minds and ideas. So it's a great example of another fragmentation in our culture of marriage as we've separated those two. And even among then highly religious young people, if those are fragmented, if what they hear is the secular model of marriage that is about that extensive delayed pattern and other forms of preparation and foundations, what has sometimes been referred to as a capstone model of marriage rather than a cornerstone, rather than something that is at the foundations of adult life that we build the rest of adult life upon. No, it's something that we get everything taken care of and then we finish it off with marriage. That secular pattern has increasingly become adopted among even the religiously faithful across a wide variety of faith groups. So as young people are chasing after that capstone model of marriage, that's a very different reality in which to try to think about an abstinent and chaste approach to marriage preparation.
And the way people also meet and fall in love has changed too over time. And this too is a product and part of the injection of contraception into what I call the mating market, how people, the pool in which we all swim and sort of figure out who we want to fall in love with and marry. So women are at a decided disadvantage in this because in some ways they gained the ability to control fertility in exchange for the control they had over sex in some ways. And so I talk about this in this video, an animated video called The Economics of Sex, which I recommend. It's 8 minutes, and it kind of explains in graphic form what happened and how it has come to be like women feel disempowered and they feel like they have to trade the advent of sex in order to sort of discern commitment. And that's a pretty new phenomenon, and it is this way in part because sort of men's expectations for sex are so much more prompt than in an era before sex was reliably going to lead to pregnancy. Now, a couple things that like the LDS do well. I mean, it's brilliant. Send kids away when they're 19, right? You know, and they come back with some maturity, etc., and they come back and perceived as more marriage material, which I think is smart. And you have a culture on this campus where it's still kind of, you know, you kind of hope or expect to meet somebody. Maybe that may not be the modal experience anymore, but there's still sort of a culture of expectation, which is largely gone from many of America's campuses, such that it's replaced with sort of what happens in the later 20s, right? But there, you know, men and women age differently in terms of sort of their what's most appealing on the mating market the older they get. So it's a process that's very unfair to women, even though they feel like the burden is placed upon them and all that. But it's complicated, and I try to take up in that animation if you Google economics of sex.
I think this was a study by, you probably helped with it, Mark, but by Jeremy Ucker that I've often thought he was looking at comparing adolescents of different religious faiths in terms of their sexual behavior. And LDS youth were significantly different than any other religious group, and still are. And there was one comment in there where he said, "It seems to be something about their doctrine," which I thought was an interesting thought that someone would highlight that, because, and what it told me is that there's hope in this, that if there's a doctrine about human being, what it means to be a human, and what it means to be male and female, and marriage, if those doctrines are true, they will shape our behavior. And so it seems like the best thing we can do is share the doctrine about human being and marriage and family. That converts behavior.
I'll dispute that just a wee bit. I don't remember Jeremy saying this, but my hunch is that it's more about social control and organized social control, where people are looking out for each other and asking them questions and
checking on.
Yeah, right. So there's no parallel. I mean, Catholics have an absolute fabulous doctrine around sexuality and marriage, but we do not have the results that you all do. So.
And maybe doctrine feeds social control in a sense, right? They're interrelated. So I'm defending myself again.
Dr. Erickson, a couple of short questions, and then I think some rest could comment on them. Can an infant bond with two fathers? I think you touched on that, but maybe to clarify that. And then, more broadly, what's the hope for a single parent who has been unable to avoid a divorce? What can we say to single parents? And I think that's probably a general question.
Just to respond, men do bond with children, and they can bond very effectively with children. There's no question, and they can do that. I think what the research shows is that there's a yearning to know a mother, and that she seems to be naturally, physiologically, psychologically oriented in a particular way, responding emotionally. That's very helpful for a particular type of bond that children need. But it's not that fathers can't bond with children. They just don't bond in exactly the same way. And there isn't a replacement for either bond, a very good replacement. Now, in terms of, there are many mothers, right, who find themselves in a place where they don't have a father involved in the lives of their children. And I heard this mother say this just a couple of weeks ago. She was crying and she said, "I never realized until the dissolution of our marriage, I cannot be him. I cannot be the father. I cannot do that." And she was frank in acknowledging a reality rather than hiding behind an idea that she could somehow do both. And in that frankness and honesty, I appreciated first her humility that allows her to then talk to her children about that. I cannot do what your dad could do. And then facilitate interactions that those children would have with healthy male role models who care deeply about them, whether it's through church or family, that would model for them what a father is to be like. And I think we discount the power of those other models in children's lives. They can be very important and effective in helping augment what isn't naturally present in the home.
Other comments on that issue? Well, let me broaden it just a little bit. What are the effects of laws and social policies on single moms and dads? What's the state of that? What do you see coming up to be concerned about? What's going on? Again, I think that's a general question. Maybe back over Ryan and Sherif first, or whoever.
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that people now, right, left, and center, can agree on is that the way that we structure a lot of our aid programs to the poor actually have marriage penalties, so that you're actually economically incentivized to not get married, because if you got married, you would receive less in terms of welfare benefits. Same thing with the tax code, Obamacare, and our normal taxation system both have marriage penalties, so that married people at a certain income bracket end up paying more in taxes than if they were both filing as single people. So one thing is just to fix these various marriage penalties, whether it's in our tax programs or in our benefit programs, to not disincentivize marriage. And then likewise, this is more coming from the right. This won't be a right, left, and center comment, but a lot of the way that our welfare program is structured is actually it incentivizes the behaviors that cause poverty in the first place. So tying financial support without work requirements, or tying financial support with each additional child that a woman has, can actually encourage some of the behavior that causes poverty, single parenthood, and lack of work. Lack of work in the male context, single parenthood more in the female context. So avoiding, if the first rule is first do no harm, avoiding policies that actually cause poverty and cause single parenting in the first place.
Again, Dr. Erickson, could some of the differences between mothers and fathers be attributable to individual personality differences, or some mothers are more playful perhaps, or just what does the research say about that?
Yeah, that's why I think that surrounding finding about how to create life is so important, because there's a lot of variation among individuals, certainly. But what science shows is these trends that you can't get away from. They just, regardless of the social environment in which people grow up, like Mike, my husband, he didn't grow up watching any siblings. He's an only child. He was never around other families. He has 3 cousins. He didn't watch anyone parent young children. And it's as natural as can be for him to hold her in that football hold. And he didn't see that. It wasn't modeled. And so certainly there are differences within people, and no question, but these trends are sort of, we can't get away from them, that repeatedly come up.
For all of you, a general question about the value of traditional gender roles in marriage. What you've said is related to that, but there's a bigger issue that usually brings out the long knives when we talk about traditional gender roles. Any comments?
Well, I think a lot of what gets said about traditional gender roles is a reaction to an extreme. So the extreme is this vision of where you have to conform to every single generalization in every individual case, and if you don't, we're going to socially punish you and ostracize you and marginalize you. But it's just a completely false alternative to think that the only way out of that is to deny all differences, to take it off our birth certificates, to pretend that it's not there, or to treat it as superficially as we would treat something like hair color or skin color. There's a middle ground, there's a golden mean in between, which just says these are important differences. When we're at the level of policy, which deals in the wholesale and not the retail, it would be foolish, it would be unjust to ignore these differences. And they're differences that we can appreciate where they occur and can even take a kind of joyful delight in them. The millennia of jokes are built around these differences. And they can be innocent. They can be a form of play and delightful appreciation of just a difference we find in nature without coming as well with a kind of ostracization and shaming of people who don't exactly fit every one of them.
I didn't mention this, but I think it's important to note that mothers working full time, their interaction patterns still have the same power. It's not how much time she's with that child, it's more the way she interacts that seems really significant. And so there's all different ways to orchestrate family life and still appreciate the unique and powerful contributions that each one makes to development. And then having said that, I think one of the things that's been fearful to acknowledge is that married couples tend toward a more traditional. Men tend to work more hours in married family in a way that you talked about, Mark, that brings out the best in each of them. We shouldn't feel afraid to acknowledge that it's okay. It's okay to be different, and it's okay that she wants to do more of that kind of thing and he wants to do more of that kind of thing, and that they're naturally adept at that in particular ways.
Dr. Regnerus, a couple questions for you, and then we're going to end with a couple of general ones. Do you have any idea how many studies that might have been subject to the kind of criticism you've got were never published because of that?
That's understanding what didn't happen is hard to estimate. It can't be too many, because I have a pretty good sense of what the population-based data that can be used out there is. So one of the reasons we did the data collection is to introduce in some ways to an area that had been long dominated by small, non-representative samples, right? So if you're talking about a share of the population that is probably no more than 2 to 4%, and then half of those are parents. Are they parents of children 0 to 18 or 18? So we're talking about, you start to slice the pie, 2 to 4%, and then cut that in half. And then, okay, if you collect 1,000 cases randomly, what are you going to get? 10, right? 10, 15, like that. There's no way you're going to be able to detect significant differences between groups if in fact they do exist. So the whole point of that study was to go where nobody had gone before and collect data from a large sample. The only thing that has been done prior to that is the U.S. Census, and they weren't asking questions about sexual orientation or sexual behavior. They've got their own issues. They're trying to discern what's a gay or lesbian couple household from the gender and number of declared heads of household. And this got in trouble in Canada, where they found all these gay couples in Saskatchewan in the oil fields, and they figured this can't possibly be the case, right? Well, it turns out there had been married men who were living with other married men sharing rent. So the census has had all sorts of troubles on this. They're improving it, and they're gonna start asking about sort of same-sex couple households, which is, from a data collection standpoint, is a good idea. At the same time, they don't really tell us a lot of interesting outcomes. We asked 40, 50, 60 different unique outcome kinds of questions for both when you were a child and when you were an adult. So it was new enough that I'm betting there's probably not a lot of studies that got done that didn't get published. And I still get sent manuscripts from good journals because they know that I've done this, right? So it's funny how professionally, you're some sort of a pariah figure, but personally, quietly, privately, they'd like to know what you think.
Yeah. An interesting one, and then we'll have just a couple of minutes. This is an interesting question. What's the effect of social media? What effect has it had on marriage relationships between husbands and wives? And I would just add on to the end of that, is there anything about this new world that can work to the advantage of building a marriage culture?
Just a quick on that. It reminded me that there's another article was published using NFSS data, and it was on this very subject because we had asked about social media usage, and of course it's inversely related to, I think it was women's marital happiness, right? So the more they use, and I had seen that. I mean, I knew this data well, and so I knew all the correlations, et cetera. So I was not surprised that was published on that. But yeah, generally speaking, the more social media you're on, the less happy and less content you are with a lot of things. I mean, with what you have, what you don't have, spouse you're with. I mean, your Facebook puts you in touch with all these people that you haven't seen in years. I mean, there's some functionality to sort of cutting ties, right? Which have exploded, these old ties, today in a way that they didn't used to be. Most of us can navigate that successfully. Not everybody. So that's just one brief answer to that.
Anyone else?
I think on the question of the culture, it does sometimes give you a false impression of what everybody's thinking, right? Yeah. So because I go to secular liberal schools, almost all my friends are from those communities, and it gives me I'm shocked every time I meet a conservative now. I'm just floored that there's anybody in the world besides Ryan and the other people on this panel who think that marriage is a man and woman. And you can imagine how things going the other direction and so on. So I think one thing it does is it creates this momentum effect, either positively or negatively. Either it reinforces your views, this is the only rational view, everybody else is crazy, they're not in my friend group, or the opposite, the sense that everyone's against you. And I think those, anytime you try to draw like generalizations about a population from something like your social network, there's a problem.
Right. Sociologists call that pluralistic ignorance, where you are ignorant of what the plurality actually thinks, but you're making assumptions that it's not in step with what you think, which ultimately often leads you to change your behavior, right? Which is a problem. So this is why this finding in this new data set that 26% of 18 to 24-year-olds haven't made up their mind on same-sex marriage, which is actually interesting information, right? I mean, that bucks the idea that young people have made up their minds, and if I had shown a statistic saying that 95% of them were on board with same-sex marriage, a lot of people would not have contested that, even though you would never see that kind of data, those kind of 95 to 5% in social science on attitudes, right? Sure, it leans liberal among that population, but there is still a significant share who are against it, and a significant share who doesn't know what they think, right?
Thank you for your comments and for your questions. We're running just a little bit late, but we want to give the final word to